in a dark bedroom, permeated with the smell of cheap alcohol and the muffled echoes of yesterday's confessions. The girl clutched a knife. Her gaze mingled jealousy, rage, and despair. When the blade fell, blood splattered the walls, ending a bond that had begun with trust and intimacy. The story begins in a small American town, where neighborhood connections and friendships often played a more important role than any social network. Two girls, Sarah and Emily, met in high school. They were both outgoing, energetic, and eager to stand out from their usual circles. Sarah was distinguished by her calm nature and analytical mind. Emily, on the other hand, was impulsive, prone to rash decisions and emotional outbursts. Their friendship developed quickly. A shared love of music and nighttime strolls around the city fostered a special bond. Gradually, their friendly attraction blossomed into romance. The first hugs, kisses, and confessions were a true revelation for both. In a small town, such a relationship provoked mixed reactions, and the girls tried to keep the intimate side of their relationship under wraps. However, it was precisely their intimacy that made their bond particularly strong. They trusted each other, shared their experiences, and made plans. For Emily, this relationship became more than just a love affair, but the center of her life. She gradually began to distance herself from family and friends, believing Sarah to be the only person capable of understanding her. Sarah, more balanced, continued to socialize and maintain relationships with friends, including Daniel, an old-school friend. At first, Emily treated him calmly, but over time, she began to notice that Sarah was spending too much time in his company. Their walks, conversations, and laughter together left her with a painful sense of jealousy. She increasingly began to question why anyone else was needed when she was here. Sarah tried to explain that Daniel was just a friend, but her words fell on deaf ears. Gradually, Emily's jealousy transformed into obsession. She monitored Sarah's messages, called her in the evenings, and demanded reports on where and with whom she spent her time. Any mention of Daniel's name became a source of conflict. Their relationship, which had begun with trust and support, increasingly resembled a battlefield. Despite their conflicts, the girls remained together. Sarah saw Emily as someone who needed her care and tried to smooth things over. But for Emily, the thought grew stronger every day. If she couldn't completely possess Sarah, she would lose her forever. At such moments, Emily began to fantasize about how to remove Daniel as an obstacle. These thoughts still seemed distant, almost absurd, but they became firmly entrenched in her mind. Every time Sarah smiled while talking to her friend, a mixture of pain and anger flared in Emily's heart. By the end of the first chapter, their relationship no longer resembled a story of young love. It had increasingly become a drama, with one party striving to maintain balance while the other descended into destructive dependence. And this became the foundation for the future tragedy, the consequences of which forever changed the lives of all participants in this story. Over time, the differences in the girls' personalities became increasingly noticeable. Sarah remained open and friendly, finding it important to connect with people, share her experiences, and receive feedback. For Emily, Serena's independence became a source of constant anxiety. Every evening spent apart felt like a betrayal. A turning point came when Sarah and her friend Daniel participated in a student project. They were assigned to work together for a local university, which required them to spend a lot of time together, in the library, computer labs, and meetings with faculty. Sarah was thrilled by the opportunity, considering the project an important step in her future career. Emily, however, saw it as a direct threat to their relationship. She began calling Sarah several times a evening, demanding to know where she was and who she was with. If the calls went unanswered, Emily would become hysterical. Sometimes she would come to the university to make sure Sarah was actually working on a project and not spending time with a friend for some other reason. These scenes became increasingly tense, causing confusion among those around her. In conversations with her loved ones, Sarah admitted she felt pressure but didn't want to end the relationship. She believed Emily simply needed time to cope with her jealousy. Friends advised her to stay away from the overly emotional girl, but Sarah was hesitant to take that step. Meanwhile, Emily's jealousy became increasingly aggressive. She would suddenly appear at Daniel's apartment and spy on his movements. Several times, she left notes in his mailbox hinting that he should stay away from Sarah. Daniel found these behaviors alarming, but he didn't want to provoke an open conflict and tried to remain neutral. Emily increasingly began to suggest that Sarah should cut off contact with Daniel. Her arguments lacked logic, only a fear of losing control of the situation. She claimed that friendship was impossible without a romantic connection, and that Daniel was allegedly hiding his true intentions. Sarah denied these allegations, but her explanations did nothing to reassure Emily. Amid the constant tension in their relationship, violent outbursts began. Emily would roughly grab Sarah's arm during an argument or push her in a fit of rage. Sarah tried to ignore it, attributing it to her friend's emotional state. However, the facts indicated that the conflicts went beyond ordinary disagreements. One evening took on particular significance when Sarah returned home later than usual. She was tired after working on a project and hadn't noticed Emily's missed calls. When she entered the apartment, Emily greeted her with aggressive questions. Where had she been? Who was she with? Why hadn't she answered? During the argument, Emily uttered the phrase for the first time, "If you're not with me, you'll be with no one." The threat sounded terrifying, but Sarah chose to ignore it, despite feeling a sense of unease inside. Over the following weeks, the control intensified. Emily would check Sarah's phone, read her messages, and ask endless questions. In intimate moments, this manifested itself in an obsessive desire to assert her power over her partner. Their intimacy was increasingly characterized not by warmth and trust, but by elements of pressure and psychological dominance. The situation was becoming increasingly difficult for Sarah, but she couldn't bring herself to end the relationship. Deep down, she hoped Emily would change. However, Emily herself was increasingly immersed in her own suspicions and fears. An obsessive thought had formed in her mind. Daniel was the main obstacle to her happiness. By the end of this stage, conflicts and jealousy had become part of the girls' daily lives. For Emily, there was no other way out but to eliminate her rival. In her mind, this was the only way to keep Sarah close. Gradually, thoughts of a possible crime ceased to seem alien and began to take on concrete form. After months of constant conflict and jealousy, the thought had finally taken hold in Emily's mind. If Daniel were eliminated, Sarah would no longer be distracted and would be alone with her. These thoughts didn't emerge suddenly. They formed gradually from numerous small moments. Every time Sarah laughed around her friend, Emily's irritation grew, and she could no longer control it. At first, her thoughts were abstract. She imagined Daniel disappearing from Sarah's life, her stopping seeing him and focusing solely on the relationship. But gradually, the fantasies took on more concrete forms. Emily began to ponder how she could solve the problem. She studied Daniel's habits. She knew where he studied, what time he left the university, and what routes he took home. Several times, she followed him deliberately, testing how easy it would be to catch up with him in a secluded place. Emily noted details: dark alleys, poorly lit sections of the road, the rare hours when there were almost no people nearby. At the same time, she tried not to reveal her suspicious behavior to Sarah. On the contrary, she demonstrated attention, occasionally arranging romantic evenings to conceal her own intentions. However, in such moments, her intimacy took on a different tone, not so much an expression of love as a confirmation of her desire to control her partner. One day, during an argument, Sarah said she intended to continue her friendship with Daniel, adding, "He's always been there for her, even before we started dating." For Emily, these words sounded like confirmation that her rival would never disappear voluntarily. From that moment on, her resolve became firm. She bought a knife at a hardware store. She did so without much hesitation. She explained to the salesperson that she needed a kitchen tool for her home. It seemed like a mundane purchase, but for Emily, the item took on special meaning. She held it in her hands, tried it on, and imagined how she would use it. The knife became a symbol of her future actions, part of a plan forming in her mind. At the same time, Emily explored the possibility of creating an alibi. She planned in advance what she would say if asked about her whereabouts at a certain time. Several times, she deliberately left notes or made phone calls during the hour she was observing Daniel, so she could refer to them if necessary. The relationship with Sarah remained tense. Emily noticed her friend becoming increasingly withdrawn and suspicious. Sometimes she'd ask if everything was okay, but Emily would give short answers. During intimate moments, Emily would display excessive passion, as if trying to prove that she alone had the right to Sarah's attention and body. This was a worrying sign for Sarah, but she continued to hope that the crisis could be overcome. Several times, Emily tried to start a conversation about how it would be easier to live without unnecessary people around. She hinted that some friends were getting in the way of real relationships. Sarah dismissed these words as exaggerations, dismissing them as meaningless. To her, such phrases sounded more like jealousy than real intentions. The culmination of her preparations came that evening when Emily followed Daniel to his home and confirmed he was returning alone. She stood in the dark and watched him open the apartment door. That moment solidified her resolve. She knew, next time, she wouldn't limit herself to observation. Emily carefully chose the day. She knew Sarah would be at university, working on a project. This gave her a few hours of freedom. In the criminal's mind, the plan was simple. Wait until Daniel was alone, catch him in a secluded place, carry out the plot, and escape, leaving minimal traces. Everything seemed logical and predetermined. In her mind, murder ceased to be something impossible. It became a means, painful, but, as she saw it, necessary. Emily didn't perceive it as a crime, but rather as a way to preserve what she considered hers. By the end of this stage, her thoughts had finally coalesced into a plan. She was ready to act, confident that eliminating her rival would solve all her problems. For her, the future seemed simple. Sarah would remain by her side, and all obstacles would be removed. The day that would later become pivotal in this matter began normally. Sarah went to the university, where work on a project and meetings with professors awaited her. Emily took advantage of this opportunity to put her plan into action. There was no longer any doubt in her mind. She had to act now. She had brought a knife, previously hidden in her backpack. Outwardly, she appeared calm, betraying no inner tension. Emily knew Daniel returned home at roughly the same time, so she left the apartment several hours before the appointed time to take up a position near his house. The location was deliberate, a narrow alley next to a parking lot, rarely frequented by strangers. There were no security cameras, and the lighting was only partially working. Emily stood in the shadows, listening to every step, until she finally heard familiar sounds, the measured rhythm of Daniel's footsteps and the creaking of his backpack. As he approached, she came forward to meet him. At first, he recognized her and was surprised. "Emily, what are you doing here?" She didn't answer right away. There was a tension in her gaze that made him wary. Daniel took a step back, but Emily abruptly advanced and drew her knife. The blow was swift, aimed at the chest. Daniel tried to resist, pushing her away, but the second and third blows drained his strength. Muffled sounds of struggle echoed through the alley. He tried to scream, but his breath caught in his throat. Several minutes of struggle gave way to silence. His body went limp and fell to the ground. Emily stood over him, breathing heavily, clutching the bloody knife. The first seconds after the murder, she was in a daze. The situation she'd been pondering for so long had become reality. One thought flitted through her mind. Now everything would be okay. Now Sarah would be left alone with her. Emily looked around, making sure no one was around, and tried to cover her tracks as best she could. She pulled the body closer to the wall, keeping it in shadow. Daniel's backpack remained nearby, and she didn't take his things, fearing it would attract attention. She wiped the knife on the sleeve of her jacket, but didn't dare hide it. She returned it to the backpack. As Emily left the crime scene, she felt a mixture of fear and relief. Fear, because she realized she had done something irreparable. Relief, because she believed her relationship with Sarah would now be saved. That evening, she greeted Sarah as if nothing had happened. They had dinner together, and Emily tried to act as calm as possible. Sarah didn't notice anything unusual, only remarked that her friend seemed tired. Emily attributed this to a busy day. By this time, Daniel's family had already begun searching for his body. He hadn't arrived home on time and hadn't answered his calls. Initial messages to friends and family soon turned alarming. A few hours later, the police received a missing person report. The next day, a passerby spotted his body in the same alley and reported it to the police. A task force arrived at the scene. The evidence they discovered, blood on the pavement, shoe prints, and signs of a struggle, immediately indicated a violent death. An investigation began immediately. Emily was entering a new phase, concealing her involvement and convincing Sarah that nothing unusual had happened. But from that moment on, her life became the focus of police attention, who were gradually getting closer to solving the mystery. The discovery of Daniel's body came as a shock to the local community. The young man was known as a quiet, friendly, and responsible student. Police immediately classified the incident as a homicide. The nature of the injuries and signs of struggle at the crime scene ruled out accidental death. Within hours, the victim's social circle was identified. Among the first to be mentioned were Sarah and her friend Emily, who, according to acquaintances, exhibited excessive jealousy and controlling behavior. Detectives began by interviewing witnesses. Several neighbors confirmed hearing muffled sounds of a struggle in the alley that evening, but no one dared to intervene. Nearby surveillance cameras only captured the general flow of passersby, not the crime itself. Nevertheless, investigators obtained important clues: the time of the attack and a rough description of the person leaving the scene, a thin woman in a dark jacket carrying a backpack. The very next day, the police spoke with Sarah. She said she had been at university that evening and returned home later than usual, where Emily was waiting for her. Sarah said Emily seemed tense, but attributed it to fatigue. When investigators asked what Emily had been doing that evening, Sarah was unsure. This immediately aroused suspicion. Meanwhile, the evidence collection process began. Shoe prints were found at the crime scene, matching the sneakers later found on Emily during a search. Traces of blood were also found on her jacket, although she claimed they were remnants of a cut in the kitchen. An examination determined the blood belonged to Daniel. Emily's interrogation proceeded in several stages. Initially, she denied any involvement, claiming she had been home the entire time, cooking dinner and waiting for Sarah. However, inconsistencies in her testimony became apparent. She couldn't explain why her phone contained deleted calls made in the area where the murder took place. Experts reconstructed the data and confirmed that her mobile phone had been located near the crime scene. The pressure from investigators gradually increased. Emily was presented with forensic evidence and witness testimony. At one point, she broke down and confessed to the attack, though she tried to justify her actions by citing emotional distress. She claimed she hadn't intended to kill, but just wanted to talk, but the situation had gotten out of control. However, the nature of the knife attacks, their number and direction, completely contradicted this theory. Sarah found herself in a dire situation. She was a witness at the trial and forced to reveal details of their relationship. Her testimony confirmed Emily's excessive jealousy, scenes of pressure, and threats. For the court, this became further evidence of the motive for the crime. The hearings took place in the district court. Journalists attended, and the case generated widespread public attention. The public was shocked. A murder motivated by jealousy in a seemingly ordinary young couple sparked widespread debate. The prosecution built its case on a combination of evidence: bloodstains, shoe prints, phone records, the defendant's confession, and witness testimony. Emily's lawyers attempted to mitigate the charges, citing her unstable mental state, emotional distress, and dependence on Sarah. The defense insisted the crime was committed in a state of passion. Nevertheless, the court found the prosecution's case convincing. The verdict noted that Emily's actions were premeditated. She acquired the knife, stalked the victim, and chose the time and place for the attack. All of this indicated direct intent. As a result, Emily was found guilty of premeditated murder. The court sentenced her to a lengthy prison sentence in state prison, excluding the possibility of parole for the first few decades. For Sarah, this was a devastating blow. She lost not only a close friend, but also her partner, who turned out to be a murderer. After the trial, she avoided public comment, limited her contacts, and tried to return to her studies, although the media attention continued for a long time. The case became one of the most talked about in the area, demonstrating how jealousy and obsession can escalate into tragedy. Court documents and witness testimony served as an example of the dangers of destructive forms of dependency and control in relationships. The story ended with a harsh sentence and shattered lives. Sarah was left with the heavy burden of loss, Emily with decades of imprisonment, and Daniel's death was an irreparable loss. This case showed how jealousy and obsession can turn into deadly crime.